Good afternoon, students. Today we're going to talk about the vice of avarice or greed from using once again Dr. Rebecca DeYoung's book Glittering Vices as our foundation. As always, much of my discussion will go beyond what Dr. DeYoung's book says, so I hope you'll take good notes, especially on those portions that are not included in the book. I'll try to highlight those for you during the talk, but nevertheless, you should be taking very, very good notes on this. Okay, this is a good time to make sure that we all have an understanding of the nature of the virtues and the vices. So remember, the virtues and the vices, these are what some philosophers call settled dispositions to act in various ways in certain circumstances. The virtues and the vices also include things like having particular attitudes and taking pleasure in various things and being pained by various things. So, for example, in a song that I linked to in one of the early blog posts by One Direction, or I don't know who, One Republic, sorry. The song that talks about, how the singer or the author of the song feels some pleasure in doing the wrong thing and maybe is pained in doing the right thing. That is a telltale sign that that person does not have the virtues. As you grow in obtaining the virtues, you will take pleasure in doing the right thing and you will be pained at doing the wrong thing. The person who is well on their way to becoming vicious, to obtaining a vice, is someone who takes pleasure in doing the wrong thing and experiences pain and serious difficulty in doing the right thing. So that's a good indication of where you are in the life of virtue and vice. What do you take pleasure in? What pains you? Uh, Virtues and vices, remember, are acquired through repeated actions, repeated thoughts, repeated attitudes, repeated emotions and feelings. And so uh, you can acquire a virtue or acquire a vice by doing something over and over and over again until it becomes habitual, until you engage in that activity or have that thought or feeling really without any kind of reflection. It just comes about. You, I think in a previous lecture I asked you to listen. I suggested listening to a podcast from NPR on Radiolab. It's a podcast on heroes, and at the end of it, one of the heroes describes how a man fell into a subway and he jumped into the subway immediately to save the guy, and then he did some extraordinary things in order to save the person. I won't tell you what they are. If you Google Radiolab heroes, you'll be able to listen to it. But then later on, I believe he describes himself as not feeling heroic because he did it out of instinct. It was he didn't hesitate. He just saw what needed to be done and did it. And what's ironic here is that that's actually precisely the behavior of a genuine hero. Someone who doesn't have to think about what they're doing and nevertheless does the right thing. Now, if he acquired that ability to do something courageous and generous and loving in the way that he did, in the way that he saved this stranger, risking his own life, if he acquired that ability of courage, the ability of generosity, the gift of generosity, or the habit of generosity and lovingness, if he acquired that by years earlier, reflecting on things and thinking, no, the generous thing to do here is to give a bigger tip or give away some of my clothing, or the courageous thing to do here is to stand up for what is right, even though it might force, I might lose my job or lose a friend or something like that. If he was that kind of person, and then after practicing those kinds of actions, He just does the courageous thing, the generous thing, the loving thing, as a part of who he is. It's just second nature to him. Then he is genuinely courageous, genuinely generous and loving. Okay, so that's the virtues and the vices. A great illustration of this is through the television show Breaking Bad. Some of you might be familiar with it. If you're not, I highly recommend it. It's not a TV show to watch with children, but I also don't think that it's a TV show that is inappropriate, really, in various ways. There might be a scene or two in the show that would be inappropriate, but perhaps not. Nevertheless, in the show Breaking Bad, we see someone who starts off, having some real qualms, some real hesitation over engaging in various activities, and by the end of the show, we see someone who does those same activities even worse without thinking, without hesitation. And so the character in Breaking Bad, the main character there, certainly one of the vices I think he acquires is avarice or greed. He definitely acquires other vices, I think vainglory certainly being one of them as well. But it's a fascinating portrayal of how he starts off reluctant, he starts off hesitating to do these terrible deeds, and by the end of the show, he has become a monster. And that's exactly how the vices work in our lives. Now, most of us don't become as monstrous as him, and that's only because of other vices that we have. Cowardice, vainglory. We fear what others might think of us, so we're not as greedy as we could be. That's vainglory and greed working together, perhaps, and so on and so forth. Okay, so avarice is the more common name is greed, and one of the things that I'm going to be a stickler about, even though our author Dr. DeYoung isn't a stickler about, and other authors haven't necessarily been sticklers about, but I'm going to be. We're going to use greed to describe an attitude that is directed towards money and material possessions. So I don't want us using the term greed really to describe sex, lust. I don't want us using the term greed to describe gluttony, being greedy about food. We'll come when we get to gluttony, when we get to lust, we'll see that people often do describe those attitudes, those vices in that way, and that's fine. But I think it's important to see that greed is directed towards particular objects, material possessions, and money. So once again, the definition that we get for greed in the text is based on Aquinas, and it is that greed is an excessive love of or desire for money or any possession money can buy. So greed is an excessive love of or desire for money or any possession money can buy. So once again, we see that there's something here that is perfectly okay, because greed is an excess of that thing, right? It's an overabundance of love for or desire for money or any possession, material goods that money can get. So what that suggests then is you can have the right amount of love or desire for money, the right amount of desire for material possessions. Okay, so this gives us a nice clue as to the good that gets perverted. So remember, we're operating under the assumption that the privation theory of evil is on the right track. Maybe it's not the whole story about the nature of evil or about what badness is, but it's certainly a plausible and important story in the Christian tradition, as well as the Muslim and Jewish tradition, have regarded the privation theory of evil as correct. Even non-Christians have embraced the privation theory of evil. So the privation theory of evil says that evil is the lack of something that is supposed to be present, the absence of something that is supposed to be present. And that means then that badness, remember, badness rests upon goodness. Goodness is more basic. It's more fundamental than badness. Badness is a parasite. It's parasitic upon something that is good. It takes something that is good and it perverts it, twists it, distorts it. Okay, so what's the good thing then that this particular vice, the vice of greed or avarice, perverts? Well, I'm going to put it like this. It's our desire for stability, our desire for contentment and satisfaction of basic needs. It's what the Lord's Prayer talks about as we pray for our daily bread. So what greed does is it takes this perfectly natural and fine, even wonderful desire for stability, contentment, and satisfaction of basic needs. It takes that perfectly good desire and it perverts it. It twists it, distorts that desire for stability, contentment, and satisfaction of basic needs. It twists that desire into something that will make us monsters, right? Into something that will wreak havoc in our relationships with God, our relationships with others, and our relationship with ourselves. Part of what goes on here, I think, is that we start off by thinking that money solves various needs, right? So money solves my needs for clothing, for shelter. It solves my needs for food, right? So we think of money as solving certain needs. We think of material possessions as solving various needs. And then what happens is we extrapolate. So we reason not so crazily that money, material possessions can solve some of our needs, and then we extrapolate from there and start thinking that money can solve certain things that we need that it doesn't solve. So we go like this. Money, material possessions can solve my need for food, can solve my need for shelter, can solve my need for clothing. And then we start thinking, well, maybe money and material possessions can solve my needs for companionship, for relationships, for love. Maybe it can solve my needs for wisdom. Maybe money and material possessions will solve my very human need to know the truth. Right? We all have a human need, a human built-in desire to discover the truth about various things, to know, right? We have this deep desire to know. We want to know certain things. Science emerges, right, out of this desire for knowledge. Philosophy, right, is rooted in this deep desire to know the truth about the universe, about ourselves, about morality, about God. And so when we think of money as being a solution or material possessions as being a solution for some things, greed starts setting in by sort of whispering to us, money will solve your needs for companionship, for love, for relationship. Money and material possessions can solve your need for wisdom and knowledge and understanding and truth. Money can solve your fundamental needs for meaning and significance and value, right? You need to feel valued. You need to feel significant, and you need to have worth and meaning in your life. And so we start overextending the capabilities of money and material possessions. And the United States is a wonderful example of this. And of course, the United States, like Issa talks about in our first book, A Refutation of Moral Relativism, the United States has proven to be an incredible influence all over the world. So in China is now often regarded as many people as being saturated by this desire for material possessions, for money. India, all cultures, right, have this. And some of that is America, and of course some of that is just our built-in tendency to screw things up, right? And so America is perhaps one of the most obvious examples where greed and avarice exist at a societal level. So the good that gets perverted is our desire for stability, contentment, and satisfaction of basic needs. Greed, avarice overextends this and says money is the solution for even more of that. Money is the solution for other basic needs. And what happens is we begin to confuse the value of things with the value of persons and ultimately with the value of God, right? So we start to value things and money more than we value people, more than we value God, right? We fail to recognize that God is the giver of all good things. Greed begins to replace God with self and money. So, one way we could do this is we could write sort of a list of the most valuable things in the universe, right? And so maybe the most valuable thing in the universe or the most valuable thing in all of existence, right, would be God. Nothing could be more valuable than God if God exists. So even if you don't think God exists, you can recognize how people who believe God exists would think that God is the most valuable being. Nothing could possibly be more valuable than God. He has infinite worth, infinite beauty, infinite value. Okay, and then you might think below that are persons, right? Or maybe angels and persons in terms of value, intrinsic worth, right? So it would never be appropriate to trade any material possession for a person, a car for a person, sex for a person, no amount of money for a person. Persons can't be priced, they're priceless. Priceless in the sense that their worth is beyond pricing. It's beyond monetary value. That's what we mean by something being priceless. And so what happens with the greedy heart is the greedy heart starts to look at material possessions and money as being more valuable, having more worth than persons or relationships, right? So I value my television more than I value my wife, right? If that's the case, obviously something has gone wrong. I remember a story years ago of a wife or something like that, a girlfriend maybe, who got angry at her husband or fiance or boyfriend for watching too much football, and I think she hid the remote control, and he ended up killing her. Right, so what might be going on there is greed. It could be that greed is what's happening here. He values sports, or he values leisure, his downtime. He values entertainment more than he values this person. And we can see this in a bunch of other examples. So I'm going to give a bunch of other examples that I think where in our culture, in our society, and all over the world, where greed may very well be the root. Now, it could be that there's some other root here, but I think greed is an obvious candidate for the root of some of these behaviors. So remember that what greed does is it values certain things too highly, and then thereby it values other things not highly enough. So in general, what happens with the greedy heart is the greedy heart doesn't value objects correctly. It just gets the value of various things wrong. Persons, animals, objects, material possessions, money, all of it gets valued incorrectly with the greedy heart. And so this can result in us seeing everything as having a value in terms of monetary value, even people, right? So here are some examples. Think of euthanasia, right? Oftentimes people might give as a reason for killing people the fact that it costs too much money, right? That money plays a role here. Think of, again, assisted suicide. I want you to help me die because I don't want to be a burden upon you. This is huge in the Netherlands right now. Lots of persons are choosing to commit suicide assisted by a medical professional because they don't want to be burdens upon their family. Now notice, in these cases, the families could afford to help the parent, to help the grandparent or the sibling. They could afford it. right? They might have to give up a car, maybe they need to move into a cheaper home, maybe they need to give up some clothing, whatever the case may be. And in some cases, they don't need to give up any of that. But the person doesn't want to be a financial burden, and so they opt for suicide. In those cases, we're valuing money and things more than we're valuing people. Think of abortion. Certainly not all abortions occur out of greed. Obviously not. Some do, right? It's too expensive to raise a child. And in many cases, not all cases, right? In some cases, maybe that assessment is correct. But in some cases, really what we're saying is it's too expensive to raise a child. What we're really saying is I couldn't continue living the way that I'm living now. Right? My standard of living would change if a child came into the picture, and so abortion is justified. Right? If that's the case, it's very likely that greed is at the bottom. Right? This is a greedy heart. The value of a human person is being diminished and replaced with the value of things, the value of material possessions. People talk about population control, and oftentimes the way they talk about it sounds very, very greedy. You can think about immigration. So I'm not telling you what to think about immigration. It's a very complex topic. If you're interested, I can point you to some fascinating articles that go both ways, pro and con. To open our borders completely or to open them with various restrictions and so on and so forth. So I'm not telling you how to think about immigration in terms of politics, in terms of policy. But I am worried about our hearts when we think about immigration. I'm worried about my own heart. So, for example, is part of the reason that that some people are opposed to immigration is because it would reduce our standard of living, right? That we'd have to give up certain things that we enjoy. So once again, think of what we're saying here, right? We're saying that these material possessions, this money that I make or that I have, is more important to me than the well-being, the flourishing of another human being who needs to escape situations that are, in many cases, unfathomable to some of us, right? The poverty that people are coming out of, the danger that people are leaving. And so this is a question for us to ask ourselves, myself included, is our reluctance, our hesitation with respect to the immigration issue, is it rooted in greed? Think about the claim, they're stealing our jobs, right? Am I worried because of greed, right? That maybe I'd have to take a lower paying job in order to allow all of these immigrants into the country, or even some of these immigrants into the country. Okay, so those are some fascinating areas where I think greed may be going on. Now, it could be that even once we get rid of greed, some of the policies remain the same. But this is a question not about policies. It's a question about our hearts. What are your attitudes? How do we think about people? How do we think about sick people? How do we think about older people? How do we think about an addition to our family? How do we think about immigrants coming into the country? Do we have greedy attitudes with respect to those issues? Another way of thinking about this, or another application of this, is education. So many of you, perhaps all of you, right, are in jobs that are going, are going to get jobs, are in degrees that might pay decently well when you're done. And so, a common question that people might ask when searching for a major or searching for a minor or something is, what is that major going to get me? Right? What kind of job am I going to get? And so many people choose majors, right? Care about getting a higher education, a college education, solely in terms of money, right? So they're thinking of their education in terms of what how much money am I going to make? Or maybe it's not in terms of money, but maybe it's just in terms of job stability. Is my education going to give me a stable job for the future? Now notice, I'm not saying that that's irrelevant. What I am worried about is that we're treating education in a way that may very well be contrary to the whole point of education. So what we're doing is we're treating education as a means to making money or as a means to getting job security or job stability. And instead, perhaps we're supposed to have the attitude of treating education as a way of making us better lovers of God and better lovers of our neighbor. If that's what education is really supposed to be, or perhaps we could say education is about becoming wiser, right? It's about becoming a wiser human. It's about becoming more and more human, developing the human capacities that I have, right? It's about making me more intelligent, more discerning, more compassionate, more of a critical thinker, more patient when it comes to settling upon very, very important issues, right? Demanding that I have all of the details, as much of the facts as I possibly can gather before coming to a conclusion, right? So education makes me wiser, makes me more patient, makes me more compassionate and loving towards others. So if we think that that's what education is really about, notice then that getting a job or making lots of money is not a part of that picture of education. Now, if you become wiser, if you become a better critical thinker, if I think you become a better lover of others and lover of God, I think good jobs are going to come. Making some money is going to come. But notice what this does. It's flipped the current way that we think about education, right? So the current way we think about education is, I want to get a college degree so I can get a job. I want to get a college degree so I can make lots of money, right? And what I'm saying is that could be rooted. I'm not saying it is, but I'm saying it could be rooted in a greedy heart where we're thinking of money and we're thinking of material possessions as really the goal, as the goal of our life. And certainly our behavior, you might not say, right? I would never say that, yes, my whole point of life is making lots of money. Yes, the whole point of life is having a stable job. I would never say that. But how am I behaving? How am I treating certain things on a day-to-day basis? And I think we do this quite often when it comes to our own education. We can see this quite obviously, I think, in the liberal arts, the decline of the liberal arts in the United States. So the liberal arts, Huntington University is a Christian liberal arts institution, and the goal of the liberal arts are to liberate you. They're to free you from various things that enslave you. What are things that enslave you according to the liberal arts? A deep desire for money and for material possessions. They can enslave us. Instead of us owning them, they own us. Those are things that can enslave us. And education, a liberal arts education, is supposed to free us from that kind of slavery. And the liberal arts are declining in the United States. And so that's a sign that we're not headed in the right direction here. Greed can easily turn into relativism. Here's a nice connection with our previous book. So when we make money the measure of value, right, when we reduce everything to having monetary value, where we can put a price tag on everything, what happens is we thereby make ourselves the measure of value, right? Because we are the ones who put a price tag on things. We're the ones who give things monetary value, right? A number of years ago, I don't know if this is still the case, but Beanie Babies were huge and they were worth tons of money. And now let's pretend, if this isn't right, that they're worthless. They're not worth a dang thing anymore. Well, why? Baseball cards used to be, huge. I collected baseball cards as a kid. Got tons of them still. 30,000, I think, still. They were super valuable back in the day. They're not valuable. The cards that I have are not valuable at all, really, anymore. They're hardly worth anything, right? Why? Because we give monetary value to things. And so if everything has a monetary value, then everything's value is dependent upon us and our decisions, and bam, that's moral relativism. Nothing ends up having intrinsic value independently of our attitudes towards it. Okay, so we can easily see how greed slides into relativism. Greed is certainly against two things, two particular virtues. Dr. DeYoung tells us it's against generosity and justice. Generosity is defined as liberality, or freedom from attachment to things and money. And so once again, this goes back to something I said just a moment ago. What is our attitude when we're giving things away? Do we give it away with difficulty? Does it stress us out to give things away? Or do we give it away willingly and joyously? Furthermore, what are we giving away? So is our attitude like this? Oh yeah, I'm totally cool giving away the crap I don't use anymore. Right? So that's fine, good attitude, right? If you're not using it anymore, have a joyous, generous attitude towards the crap you don't use anymore. But what about the stuff that you do use? Could you give that away? What would your attitude be if presented with a situation where you should give away some of the stuff that you use regularly? What would your attitude be in that case? And here's the real difficulty for me. Do you even recognize those cases where you should part with things you use regularly? I'm worried that I don't even recognize those cases anymore because maybe I have bought in so much to the acquire stuff mentality that that's what's going to bring me joy and peace. So remember, here's one way of thinking about this. This is a real nice thing that Dr. DeYoung includes, is to remember what the purpose of our stuff is, the purpose of our money is. I'll put it like this. For a Christian, the purpose of possessions, the purpose of money is to advance the kingdom of God. That's the point. That's the goal. Is it advancing the kingdom of God? Dr. DeYoung puts it, certainly this is compatible with the way that I just put it. She says, possessions are meant to help us serve our and others' needs. So, why'd you buy the table you bought? Did you buy the table to serve others so more people could sit around it at mealtime? Did you buy the TV for your own, just for yourself, maybe out of vanity, right? A lot of our purchases, I think, are rooted in vanity and vainglory. Hey, everybody, look at me. I've got this really cool table. Hey, everybody, look at me. I've got this really cool TV. Hey, everybody, you get the idea. Some of it's rooted in greed, though, right? We think that this is going to make me happy. It's going to satisfy me. I've noticed this in myself. I've noticed, I'll go to Best Buy, or I'll go to the supermarket, or I'll go to the mall. I don't need a dang thing. And I'm going there to do some window shopping or something like that. Maybe because that's a distraction from some emptiness within me. That's going to provide me with some meaning, with a little bit of peace, a little bit of joy, distract me from myself, distract me from God or my marriage or whatever the case may be. And so we need to remember that our possessions are meant to serve others' needs, our needs too, but others' needs as well. So when we buy these things, we must have others in mind. Some offspring of avarice or greed. So once again, on our tree, you've got a tree, the root is pride. We've already got a bunch of branches, right? We've got the branch of envy, the branch of vainglory, the branch of sloth. Now we're going to add the branch of greed. And the branch of greed yields, right? It brings forth the fruit of, these are the offspring vices, that branch of greed brings forth the fruit of callousness towards those in need. There's a fascinating clip from Louis C.K. He's a comedian. I recommend watching him, but only watch him on talk shows. Don't watch his stand-up or anything like that. He's incredibly vulgar. But when he's on talk shows on network television, he can't be as vulgar. He can't curse or cuss or give crazy examples. But he's a fascinating analyst of our wickedness, of our sin. And he's got this great story where this girl that he picks up, she's from like Amish country. It's a friend of his niece. She's never been to New York City. She's coming out of Amish country into New York City. They pick her up from the train station. they're walking out of the train station, and there's this homeless, a bunch of homeless people. There's this guy who looks like he's half dead, laying down, and he stinks. There's flies all over him. It smells like urine and beer and whatever else, crap, whatever else, right? And this girl, she's never been to a big city in her life, and she sees this person. She runs over to him and gets down and says, "Oh my gosh, are you okay? What can I do to help?" And Louis C.K. and his friend grab her and they rip her away, and they're like, "What are you doing? Stay away from that nasty guy." And Louis C.K. says, and he says it in a humorous way. I can't do it in as humorous a way as he does. But he says, what's fascinating about this is she's the one doing the right thing. They think that, oh yeah, they're doing the right thing. They're helping, they're protecting her. And they're the ones who look at that homeless man and don't see a person anymore, right? They see a bag of stink, a bag of trash. They no longer see a human. She saw a human there and ran to his aid. They saw a bag of trash there, or something dangerous and disgusting, and ran away from it. So greed can yield callousness towards those in need, a hard heart towards those in need. Thoughtlessness. We just stop thinking about others. Right? It doesn't even come into our heads that this purchase of mine might affect others. An interesting example here is there's a great documentary on chocolate that my wife and I watched years ago. And this documentary on chocolate traced how a ton, I can't remember the percentage, but let's just say it was 75%, 60%, whatever. But a huge percent of the chocolate that we consume in the United States comes from cocoa plantations in Africa. And many of those plantations in Africa are engaged in human slavery. You've got kids who are 8, 10, 12 years old who are working 16 hours a day. People are kidnapped to work on those plantations. People are forced to work on those plantations and never allowed to leave because the plantation will charge them rent for living there that they could never possibly pay. And they'll sign documents, and these people, many of them are illiterate and have no idea what they're signing. So obviously the plantation persons are the owners are this is greed, resulting in monster type behavior. But do we care about where our chocolate comes from? How do we care about those things? Are we researching that and thinking about the people behind the stuff that we're consuming? Does that play a role in any of the products we acquire and the money that we spend? Another offspring vice of greed is, just standard stuff, right? Theft, stealing, lying. You see at Christmas time, right? People trample over others in order to get some stupid game or something that's going to be out of style next year and their kid's not going to care about at all within a year. Christmas is a fascinating example of where materialism, consumerism, greed starts replacing Jesus, starts replacing family and relationships. Some of the remedies that are discussed in the book, and I'll list, of course, some other things on the blog, activities you can engage in for extra credit, is to document how much we spend and on what. And this may reveal greed, or that may reveal vanity. It could also reveal gluttony or maybe even lust. But documenting what you spend, or how much you spend and on what, can reveal fascinating things about your heart. Tithing. A remedy is tithing. If you're a believer, if you're a Christian, tithing, right, is something that we're supposed to be doing. In fact, I left tithing out in my discussion on sloth when I was talking about the ordinary ways by which God dispenses His grace and His love in our lives, right? Well, being obedient and obeying God out of love, out of joy. Right, and so tithing, giving away, right, handing back to God, to advance the gospel, to advance the kingdom, giving 10% of our income. And here's a fascinating statistic: 1% or less of people under 25 years old tithe 10% of their income. 1% or less of people 25 years old tithe 10% of their income. That's people who go to church. Those are people who are professing Christians, tithe 1% or less of their income, tithing. Okay, here's a quote from a famous theologian that I really like. The theologian is Abraham Kuyper. This is a good quote to end on. Here's the quote from Abraham Kuyper. There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. Think about what that's saying. Nothing is ours. It's all his. There is not one square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. And rightly so.